Okay, well, very briefly, I'm honored to be a participant. I'm Senator for Nunavut and have been involved in public life in the North since being elected to 4 terms in the NWT legislature in 1979. I'm now going on 12 years in the Senate. Happy to be a participant talking very timely issues at this conference. Thanks for inviting me.
Bonjour tout le monde. My name is Peter MacKay. I'm coming to you from the East Coast, Nova Scotia. Very proud to serve on this panel with Senator Patterson, who I've worked with for many years and have enormous respect for. You couldn't get a better voice on the Arctic and the issues we're tasked with today. I agree, extremely timely, important discussion. A little bit of background, I worked in the law, but spent time in politics over the years, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Defense and Justice, and also, although didn't have any permanent residence there, worked in the Arctic, starting from my earliest days on supply ships sailing out of Atlantic Canada. My first exposure to the high north was when I was about 17. So this has always been a personal area of interest, region of our country that I've been quite fascinated with, and a place where I think many Canadians have this innate sense of belonging and fascination, but few have actually seen it. And so we need to engage Canadians in a way that will, and the world, quite frankly, that will recognize the important protective and fiduciary duty we have to the Arctic.
Great. Well, I'll get right into it and setting the stage for our conversation. We know that the events over the past several weeks, they've been devastating to say the least, and they have serious implications for global politics. Putin's invasion, we could say, into Ukraine will have long-lasting impacts for years to come for Europe and for NATO and beyond. And it really includes rupturing 25 years of peaceful and meaningful cooperation and diplomacy in the Arctic. The Arctic Council, we know, has been the basis for unprecedented collaboration among Arctic states and Indigenous organizations. It's produced world-renowned research on global climate change, fostered business collaboration. We have, helped foster to facilitate several signed treaties related to maritime cooperation, from oil spill response to Arctic Coast Guard cooperation. And Canada has channeled much of its Arctic diplomacy into the Arctic Council. So we know last week, the Arctic Council member states, minus Russia, agreed to suspend its activities for the moment. We'll put it on pause. But there also remains significant opportunity for strengthened Arctic diplomacy outside the Arctic Council. For instance, the United States and Iceland have established diplomatic representation in New Greenland. Last year, the EU announced it will also be establishing its own diplomatic mission. Other states have active honorary consulates, but Canada right now, well, we have an honorary consulate, but it's currently not active. Heightened commitment to NORAD modernization is another area where bilateral cooperation can be strengthened. Yet Canada's north continues to lack any kind of real infrastructure, whether we're talking about export corridors, supply chains, or maritime or other infrastructure for civil, economic, and military purposes. So consequently, the kind of foreign direct investment that we see interested investing in the Canadian North too often comes from non-like-minded nations, and or those that have security implications for their investment. So the infrastructure deficit and subsequent challenges this presents for Canada at this very moment, however, I think it's important to acknowledge that this is not a partisan issue or something new. Northern neglect is long-standing. Canada seems to be stuck in this same rotating conversation that began 50 years ago, frankly, with John Diefenbaker when he first announced his Roads to Resources program. Instead, the state of the North seems more about the Canadian state of mind and inability or willingness for Canada to take the North seriously in a sustained manner, to commit to the accompanying investments required, and so basically getting things done in the north. So I guess the question, to start with, and I'll kick it off here in a second, but is this, or, are we in a moment of change, or can this be a moment of change? And so, Peter MacKay, maybe we could start, with you, and, what are some of your own general thoughts about Canada's longstanding approach to its north prior to actually what's happening right now?
I think you've encapsulated a lot of where we are, which is what's important. The aspirational part is always there. It's omnipresent. All governments of all political stripes have looked to the north and seen the enormous, boundless potential, but have not actually made the necessary investments that you've spoken of. I think now is the time. Last week, last month, last year, it is something we should have been doing, but we can't change that, obviously. But the geopolitical shift that we're seeing now that is having a catastrophic impact inside Ukraine, the economic ripples that are going across Europe and here will impact as well. Basic things, supply chains, the cost of food, which are already challenges, as you mentioned. The infrastructure piece, I can only say that previous governments, some of which I were a part of, did recognize those infrastructure gaps. A deep water refueling station investment in Iqaluit, the reclamation of certain old military installments, the airfields in particular that can be reclaimed, and research stations, other military stations like in Alert. And that, well, let's be clear, in the current context, is not going to match by any stretch of the imagination what's happening on the other side of the Arctic Ocean in Russia. Russia, the current ironic chair of the Arctic Council, and Russia, who have, quite frankly, done much more than most Arctic Council countries in terms of their development of their Arctic, which is enormous. It's easy, again, for Canadians to overlook and forget that not only are they our neighbor, but they, in fact, have over 50% of the Arctic coastline. And so naturally, they recognize, perhaps where we don't, that potential and opportunity for development and the obligation that they have to their citizens, which includes Aboriginal people as well. And that in essence, is our challenge, to work closely with our First Nations, the people of the North, in terms of all decisions that need to be made. But the Arctic, on the Russia side, they've seen some 50 military installations reclaimed. Open source intelligence shows us that they are putting more permanent installations that allow them to have aircraft that fly up to and threaten our airspace. Because of the urgency of what's going on in Ukraine, this becomes all the more ominous. And these are not just, 1950s era outposts. There is weaponry and the ability to deliver attacks in very close proximity, not to mention nuclear submarines and their ships that also patrol those waters. And I don't want to take us to a dark place to start this conversation, but the Russians have been flexing their muscle in the Arctic for some time. We, on the other hand, have given our Arctic Rangers new rifles. I mentioned some of the investments that have been made, which are minimal, and we don't have modern fighter aircraft. Our NORAD installations that used to be known as the DEW line are really obsolete and need to be upgraded. We need a modern early warning system that is connected through satellite systems. This is not weaponizing the Arctic, but it's recognizing that there's a vulnerability and that we have to have necessary protection for our sovereignty, for our maritime and aerial approaches. So I think I'll stop there. It's a bit of a ramble, but we definitely require, as you said in your opening, significant revisitation of what the requirements are to protect and ensure the continued sovereignty of the North, the protection of the pristine waters, and very sensitive biodiversity that's there, in collaboration with Arctic people, and commensurate investments for things as simple as food supply. If we had more Arctic aircraft that were flying there, there's no reason why, with large Globemaster C-17 aircraft that we purchased just a few years ago, we couldn't play a much more substantial role in giving the necessary supplies. And look, last thing I'll say, broadband internet. We need to have greater connectivity in the Arctic. Big challenges, but with the technology available today, it can all be done.
Thank you so much. Senator.
Yes, thank you. Look, I see Canada as a great northern nation, and I think we should think of us as a great northern nation next in size and significance to Russia, which has half the Arctic landmass. But, you know, I've often seen Canada as a great northern nation, but in reality with a focus on the 49th parallel. Our approach as a country to the north has been marked in fits and starts. And, you know, Jessica, you mentioned my hero, John Diefenbaker, who made the north a signal of his government with Road to Resources, building the Dempster Highway, the road to Pine Point. Pierre Trudeau, actually, with the National Energy Program, provided incentives to delineate our huge energy resources and invested in the Norman Wells pipeline. And Stephen Harper government did the road to Tuck, completing the Dempster, Diefenbaker's vision, built the first Arctic ports in Pangnirtung, Iqaluit, and Pond Inlet. But mostly the Canadian government approach has been benign neglect, and too often national programs penalize the North with inappropriate rules like per capita funding. You know, we had a recent federal budget that gave 60 housing units to Nunavut with a shortfall of 3,000 units and growing. Allocations or rules like those of the Canada Infrastructure Bank that require returns on capital investment, which are impossible in regions with a small population base in the north. Broadband policy currently fails to understand that we need to build redundancy in broadband infrastructure because one link is not enough when the whole system can and does go down. So the record has been mostly benign neglect, in my view. There have been summer sovereignty visits, but over the years, our approach has been absence of mind for the North. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. And maybe just to give the folks a little bit of what Dennis is speaking of is, you know, when our telecommunication systems goes down, we literally have our RCMP force, the Royal Canadian Military Police, issuing statements to our communities that if you need their services, that we actually physically have to attend their detachment. That is the state of our telecommunications. So when we're talking about security, it's human security, but it's also national security because the military and the defense equally say that what they need and want is basic infrastructure in our northern communities, which they too rely on. So when a plane crashed in Resolute Bay a few years back, the military happened to be on site doing a defense exercise, you know, thankfully. However, the CBC had to actually issue a statement to the territory. Please do not use your phones. The folks on the ground, the first responders, need that broadband, that connectivity so that they can communicate amongst themselves and to Iqaluit and to Trenton to bring up the additional support required to deal with the event that was happening on the ground. That is the state, you know, our telecommunications. And so everything from sort of like, you know, what is happening in Ukraine, and as Peter and Dennis has said, is we need significantly more, you know, investments. We need it to be strategic investments, and that it is both, you know, multi-purpose, multi-user, multi-benefit, because that is literally the state that we're in. Is there anything that you'd want to add, Peter?
Yeah, that's a great point, Jessica. I got a chill up my spine when you mentioned Resolute Bay. I was there with the Canadian Forces when that exercise happened. It was one of the more surreal moments in my life when we were simulating the response to an air crash, and it happened in real time. And so there was initial confusion, and you're right, there was a lot of communication challenges, but the initial confusion was to get the word out to soldiers and rangers in the field that this was not an exercise, that this was now actually happening. It was just bizarre, but it highlighted, as you have, the shortcomings that we have in search and rescue, the shortcomings that are there for basic human life, access to telecommunications, but food and fuel and connectivity with the South. These will require significant investments, and the politics, not the partisan politics, but the return on investment calculus that goes through the mind of all governments, including the territorial governments, is how do you justify it across such a vast geography? Will it just be a drop in the bucket? But hearkening back to Prime Minister Diefenbaker again, it all starts and it will continue incrementally. And so those refueling stations, shared facilities, as you highlighted again, are extremely important. There's no reason why territorial, federal government across departments cannot share research stations, military bases, share equipment, share communications. That makes perfect sense, and it's practical. And that's why I say, again, for emphasis, the fly-in, fly-out supply chain, the military could be far more engaged in those activities. There's no reason that the empty planes should ever be going up to the Arctic. One of the challenges, and Senator Patterson could speak to this in far more detail and with personal knowledge, is the cleanup of the Arctic, of sites that were used for construction and mining and otherwise, where equipment and fuel barrels and things were just abandoned. There are interesting waste to energy technologies that could be used now and deployed as a source of energy into many small communities in the Arctic. So technology is going to be part of the lifeline and the improvement that we see, but we need to deploy it, invest it, and get the political will behind it.
So I'm going to ask you both, how do you see the Russian invasion into the Ukraine, having not only the long-term impact on the Arctic, there's articles that are coming out, but also what the, unfortunately, the opportunities that it also presents. So we know that there are many Arctic or non-Arctic nation states like China and India and others that actually have Arctic strategies, and that who are actively interested, as I said in my opening remarks, they have their eye on the prize, and the prize is us. The prize is our Arctic. So I'd love to hear your views on what impact this is likely to have in Arctic cooperation, Arctic investments, Arctic priorities.
Maybe I'll start. Thank you, Madeleine. The Russian invasion, the question is timely. I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a terrible blow to Arctic cooperation. And, we have to remember there's been a trend since the Cold War ended and Gorbachev envisioned an Arctic zone of peace. And, I was involved in vibrant exchange between Arctic governments and circumpolar indigenous peoples in the 80s with Greenland and the Soviet North. Canada led the development of the Arctic Council, which set aside military and security issues to focus on collaboration, as has been outlined in the panel earlier, search and rescue, oil spill response, climate change collaboration, environmental cooperation on things like sensitive issues like the Arctic fishery, and also social issues like mental health and suicide. Recognizing that Arctic nations have so much more in common with each other than with their southern reaches. Now we've got the decision to pause the Arctic Council, ironically, when Russia was the chair. The years of trust and goodwill have been shattered at the national level. A May Arctic Council meeting in Arkhangelsk, Russia, is canceled, and I fear that this won't be easily undone, despite the strong personal ties, Madeleine, that you spoke of earlier this morning. And Inuit are still talking within the Inuit Circumpolar Conference, but I fear that the growing isolation of Russia could deprive the Arctic Council of vital participation of a huge and influential Arctic state, which had been positively influenced to cooperate on environmental issues and in areas like cooperatively drawing offshore boundaries under the UN Conference on the Law of the Sea. So this is very worrisome and a blow to the enormous progress that's been made with Canada's lead in establishing the Arctic Council. Thank you.
For my part, I very much agree with everything Senator Patterson has just said. I recall well our representative at the Arctic Council, Leona Glukak, who was the member of parliament for Nunavut, some of the senators worked closely with, having very productive and sometimes even confrontational exchanges with then Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who was my counterpart for a time 15 years ago, which speaks to their political system. But the forum itself, as was pointed out, was a wonderful forum to address the many issues that some of which we've touched on here and more, and a place to sort out differences, a place whether they were geographic boundaries and the the Beaufort Sea delineation between Canada and the United States, that has been a frozen conflict at the United Nations for a long time. But the Arctic Council allowed face-to-face, eye-to-eye discussions to really move the dial on some of these important issues. The war in Ukraine, Putin's aggressive, illegal, maniacal invasion of Ukraine has melted the trust and the connectivity that existed in that forum. You mentioned China. I'm very worried about China. I have been for a very long time. You only have to look at what's happening in their country vis-a-vis their neighbors and building islands in the contested waters of the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the menacing of their neighbors. But more concerning and undeniably threatening is the fact that they are building icebreakers. They will have more icebreakers, more nuclear submarines than we will be able to contend with, because we don't have them. We have one, the Diefenbreaker, that is still being built on the West Coast. We have new Arctic offshore patrol vessels that are half built, but our capacity to patrol those waters, to exert our sovereignty, to demonstrate control, and not just control for sovereignty reasons, but to watch out for spills, to provide search and rescue, to ensure that we are able to deliver goods at certain times of the year. All of this is threatened in very real fashion by the activities of countries like Russia and China, and frankly others that have their designs on a gateway passage through internal Canadian waters. And so the Arctic Council was the place where many of those very real-time issues could and should be addressed, and now we've had to hit pause.
And so, we're talking about this, and we're talking about in the context of what is happening right now. And so, we wonder, are we focused on the North because we're in this moment, or will there be something beyond? And I'm, going to talk a little bit outside than just this, the military focus. And we heard a lot about it this morning. When we look around at our Arctic neighbors, right, we see they're building data centers, test tracks for automated cars, powering themselves and others with everything from renewable energy to offshore gas projects using carbon capture and storage. And we know that we're still, the challenges that we have because we're missing some of the most basic social infrastructure. And we have the Northern Arctic Policy Framework. But the question should be then, well, do we need an Arctic strategy? But then if we're going to have an Arctic strategy, do we need to have really first a long-term vision for what we want the North to look like in 10, 20, 30 years? And so, when we talk a lot of things about, like, let's say NORAD modernization, I don't know, I'm just wondering, is it time to modernize our vision and our understanding of the North?
I would say unquestionably yes, and the vision informs the strategy. And the epicenter of that has to be the input of the Inuit people as to how they envision the Arctic. What are their essential needs? Some of which, you know, you've mentioned already: energy supply, food supply, protecting their way of life, the delicate fauna and wildlife. There are so many issues and important considerations that need to be factored in, but you know, a strategy can be updated, obviously, and it should span the cycle of politics. One of the unfortunate realities is that we have such a, you know, a permanent, perpetual election cycle now that interferes and in some cases results in cancellation of the longer term vision, investment in projects, some of which the senator has mentioned. And that, you know, that is truly unfortunate, because you know, you frame this discussion as saying it's not a partisan issue. It really isn't. It's a security issue, a national issue, human issues that need to transcend some of the partisanship that has leaked into every aspect of life.
I think you're asking, Jessica, whether these developments in the world will fundamentally change Canada's regard to the North. And I just want to say that I believe strongly, and there's a Time magazine current headline story: Ukraine's conflict has rippled all the way to the Arctic Circle. This event, I hope, and this may be a positive, a silver lining in the cloud, that this event can be a wake-up call for Canada. You know, without the Arctic Council to hold it accountable, there are real fears that Russia biggest carbon sink in the world after the Amazon. You know, rampant gas flaring, using its fleet of 40, yes, 40 nuclear and other icebreakers to deplete delicate Arctic fish stocks or even impede foreign vessel traffic in the polar seas. So Canada's going to have to step up and no longer be caught flat-footed. You know, Peter talked about the infrastructure deficit. You know, the Nanisivik Naval Refueling Facility was first announced in 2007. It's faltered by budget overruns and construction problems, and still not complete. The Northwest Passage, we cannot afford to lose our declaration that the Northwest Passage is internal waters. We have to take sovereignty seriously and be able to monitor and patrol the Northwest Passage, to be able to complete the charting of the Arctic, to build our Arctic class icebreaker, which is currently forecast to be complete in 2030, to force adventurers, travelers to provide bonds for search and rescue. So, and then Arctic sovereignty has to involve our people, our communities, and real progress on giving Canada's rangers an Arctic and a marine capability and providing more support. You know, Professor Hubert at the University of Calgary, who's an expert on security issues, says if the Northwest Passage becomes international waters, then that also would allow aircraft overflights, which would even more seriously jeopardize North American security. So I think we need to focus on the North as never before as a country. And maybe this threat from Russia, and as Peter has described, from China, who considers themselves a near Arctic state, will allow us to finally commit to, and you, Jessica, you mentioned the modernization of the North Warning System. Canada has yet to make a firm commitment to participating in that much needed modernization. We're dealing with ancient equipment to monitor for, you know, hypersonic missiles that China and Russia are building. So Canada's got to step up. Thank you.
So thank you for mentioning that, Senator, regarding the fact that Canada and the United States have agreed to NORAD modernization. Should the investments, should the sort of actions required be accelerated because of the recent events in the last couple of weeks? Peter.
Yes, undoubtedly they should, because the threat becomes all the more imminent and real. And that, you know, as the old saying goes, we should never waste a crisis. This is an opportunity in time where we have heightened awareness of our vulnerability in the Arctic for all the reasons that the senator has laid out and more. If this involves, you know, forging ahead without Russia as part of the Arctic Council, so be it. We kicked them out of the G8. I think there is reason to suspend them from the Security Council. And this is not to suggest that, you know, we can completely isolate Vladimir Putin, but at this moment in time, it is part of the toolbox that we can unpack to enforce sanctions, to put internal pressure on the country that could lead to internal changes that need to happen in that country to prevent the insanity of crossing international borders. The threat of nuclear we could speak of in very dark and ominous terms, but the fact of the matter is that the entry point, the easiest entry point for attack into North America is through the Arctic, and so that early warning system that Senator Patterson spoke of is 20 years out of date and requires joint investment to have the necessary response time to incoming missiles or blackjack bombers, as they're often referred to, bear bombers from the Russian side, and or North Korea or rogue nations. This is not just war games or apocryphal thinking. It's the reality of the volatility that we live in now. Nobody would have predicted even a month ago that we would see the type of unilateral invasion coming from Russia, in spite of things like Crimea and in spite of their invasion of Georgia and all of the saber rattling that's been happening. But here at home, in Russia or in Canada, the Russian threat is very real. It doesn't stop at the border between Ukraine and other European states. It is a very real threat to our security in North America. And so I'm hoping that the political impetus now has moved and that you will see both Canada and the United States firmly commit to making the necessary investments to upgrade our early warning system in the north.
Thank you.
Do you want to open up questions?
I'm going to give an opportunity, if you don't mind, Dennis and Peter, if there are any questions from the participants here. We've got one. Yeah, there's a mic. It's at the back. And if you don't mind introducing yourself so that the senator and Peter know who you are.
Hello, I'm Roy Eriksson, the Finnish ambassador in Canada. I was listening with quite interest how you foresee the need to have the capacity to have ice-breaking capacity in the north. I do understand why Canada has chosen the way of building their own icebreakers, and there are considerable delays. But with the changing situation now that Russia is posing a real threat, would it be prudent to consider at least buying icebreakers from a country that has so far built 60% of all the icebreakers in the world and designed 80% of them, that is Finland?
Finland makes great ships, there's no question. And look, there's precedent for doing this. Because we are, as was pointed out, still 10 years probably away from the completion of our first major icebreaker. And it won't be an icebreaker, to be clear, that will have the same capacity as what the Russians and the Americans have. And so, yes, I think that's worth considering. We, Canada, had to scramble to get refueling capability for the Canadian Armed Forces when our HMCS Protector and Preserver were both deemed to be obsolete, and we had to accelerate our building of a refueling ship and rent or lease. We've done it with ferries in the past to get us through a rough patch. And so I think, if there are ships available, it's something absolutely that Canada should be considering as a stopgap But I might ask the ambassador while we have him whether Finland and perhaps he has a view on Sweden as well are considering joining NORAD as a knock-on effect of what's happening in Ukraine.
It might be too premature, but I can tell you that the mood has changed both in Sweden and in Finland about NATO and what kind of options that would give our two countries. I just received a message that our parliament will debate the issue of NATO this spring.
Thank you. I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I know it's a live issue when it comes to NATO membership.
Hello. Another question.
Hi there, my name is Pat Duxbury. I'm the Executive Director of the Inuit Development Corporation Association. Thank you to the speakers for joining us today. I have a question, which is, basically the proposal I think we're talking about, which is a large build out of infrastructure that would serve both commercial and defense benefits for the North. So even assuming that there is the willpower to do so and the budgetary capacity, which is something we need to consider in the overhang of debt we have right now, and and possibility of raising interest rates in that whole environment. Assuming we have the will and the fiscal capacity, does the federal government, in your opinion, have the actual tools available to deliver such a program in the same way that obviously they did in Russia? They have the advantage of an autocratic system, but they did appoint a lead agency in a lot of the northern build-out. I think was the nuclear agency, and any colleagues here are probably more informed can correct me on that, as the lead agency. Or going back to, I like the reference to John Diefenbaker, and obviously it was a very different time. And Canada was a different country back then in many respects, but there was, I guess, tools were available to kind of make it happen. Do you think we even have that capability right now, or is it just, and if so, what's your vision for how that would occur? So.
Maybe I can jump in, Pat. Look, Canada has a bigger GDP than Russia, and yet Russia has managed to build, refurbish 50 Cold War bases, and establish 13 air bases, and build 40 icebreakers, because they've made the North a priority. And as far as Canada is concerned, we have this Arctic and Northern policy framework that frankly is full of great visions and platitudes, and has a very comprehensive list of the critical northern issues, but it has no budget, no timelines, no plans, no concrete plans to address the wide range of issues addressed. And with the modernization of the North Warning System, and first of all, I want to congratulate you, Patrick, because I know you've worked with the Pan-Arctic Inuit Logistics and the Nasituk Corporation in partnership with ATCO Frontec. The Inuit-led consortium has just been awarded a contract to maintain the North Warning System going forward, worth I think $1.3 billion. It's huge progress for involvement of Inuit in the Arctic. But as the former Defense Minister Peter MacKay has said, the North Warning System itself is obsolete. It needs to be modernized. And frankly, Canada's talked about collaborating with the US on modernizing the North Warning System, but so far there is no money budgeted. There is no firm commitment to this now increasingly urgent development. So I think Canada has absolutely the capacity to build infrastructure. If the Russians can do it with a smaller GDP than us, why can't we? But the focus has got to be a change in infrastructure priorities. You know, we have a lot of money committed to infrastructure in Canada with the Infrastructure Bank and the infrastructure budget. I often say that the infrastructure budget is focused on decreasing wait times in traffic in our cities around the 49th parallel, rather than investing in sovereignty in the Arctic. So I'm hoping for a change in focus. I'm hoping that the Northern Policy Framework will lead to a renewed commitment to the Arctic. It was developed supposedly in collaboration with with Northern people and their governments, but you know, so far there's been no clear examples of holistic collaboration in delivering on the policy framework. And I'll just give a couple examples. You know, the government of the Northwest Territories contributed a chapter to the chapter from territorial governments. It stated its clear goal to develop non-renewable resources in an orderly manner and participate in co-management of its offshore. But there was a unilateral announcement of a moratorium on Arctic exploration and development, which didn't seem to show any respect to the territorial governments. In fact, gave them no notice or consultation on that major decision. The Kitikmeot Inuit Association had stated its goal of developing a road to resources to the Arctic coast from Yellowknife, you know, of the first link for Nunavut from to the North American highway system. But this has been largely overlooked by our federal government. So there's been a focus on protecting and protected areas, but without a requirement to consult territorial governments or even Indigenous organizations on the creation of these protected areas. The Inuit Crown Partnership tables discuss Indigenous specific programs and Indigenous self-government in isolation from the duly elected territorial governments, even in clear areas of territorial jurisdictions. So we've got to get beyond platitudes and funding announcements in dribs and drabs, and commit to a meaningful collaborative approach with Northern people is involved in Northern decision making. And good on the Inuit and the Pan-Arctic Inuit Logistics in winning that contract to have Inuit involved in the North Warning System. And now I hope that that'll be a basis for Inuit to be involved significantly in the modernization of that North Warning System. Thank you.
If I might just very quickly add two or three quick points to Pat's question about, you know, what will it take and the cost, which I think is very important. Who pays for it? How do we pay for what we're all talking about here? Because we're talking in the order of magnitude of tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars over decades, because these are projects that cannot just occur. And you have such a short construction cycle as well in the high Arctic because of the obvious challenges there. But things are moving. It's going to take leadership and prioritization, as Senator Patterson was just saying. And one of the interesting developments, because of the urgency and the threat cycle that we're living under right now, look at what Germany just did. Germany just doubled its defense budget. Doubled it. You know, the 2% NATO minimum, 2% of GDP that countries are required to examine, has knock-on implications for Canada's Department of National Defence and other budgetary considerations that will directly impact our ability to make some of the changes we're talking about in the Arctic, most notably this early warning system, and done in collaboration with the United States. The other area that we've given very scant attention to is public-private partnerships in these projects and partnerships with Inuit groups, although, you know, Senator Patterson again has mentioned this, but those type of partnership arrangements do exist and can exist as an accelerator or force multiplier for some of these big projects. One example, it's been talked about, but not so much of late, is pipelines. I know that this is controversy and it's layered in politics and environmental concern, but a pipeline to the port of Churchill, which then allows for transportation of LNG through the Arctic. It doesn't have to be a scary prospect. We've been transporting LNG from our coastlines for decades, and there have been very few incidents, and even fewer in the current post-Panamax era. A big investment, yes, but we can never lose sight of how we pay for these investments without overburdening a future generation or becoming such a high tax jurisdiction that nobody will want to invest in Canada, and we can't afford to float our existing infrastructure requirements. And it's politics. It is politics. It has to be translated and explained to where we are in the South. We have to make sure that people here understand the innate benefits and interests that are being protected for all of us by the development of the Arctic and the investments that we're talking about here. There's a big communications exercise that has to be undertaken. And sadly, that just has not transpired as yet. This may have lit a spark.
Whitney?
Thank you, Mr. MacKay. Thank you, Senator Patterson. Whitney Lochinbauer, North American Arctic Defense and Security Network. I want to reflect on the narratives that you're offering to us. I mean, emphasis on benign neglect, absence of mind. And yes, I understand the domestic political utility of using that kind of language to create incentives or pressure for political investments, which I obviously support. Do you see a risk in Canada and other like-minded states emphasizing our weakness compared to Russia rather than our strengths? For example, Minister MacKay, with all due respect, you emphasize the Rangers and the rifle replacement program, but not the Harry DeWolf class of Arctic offshore patrol vessels that not only perform a presence function in the north, but also feed into this layered ecosystem that NORAD has identified for North American defense and global defense leaning forward. Basic question is, if we're in a world or entering an era of battling strategic narratives, has the time passed for countries like Canada to be self-excoriating, self-flagellating all the time, to not emphasize the incredible investments we've made in governance, in land claim agreements, the incredible rates per capita that we invest in our northern territories and our northerners vis-a-vis a country like Russia, and perhaps talking about our strengths and what we're doing in solidarity with our allies, rather than these narratives that downplay what we bring to the table?
Well, it's an interesting take on it, Whitney. First of all, I did mention the Arctic offshore patrol vessels and the investment in our, basically the largest investment that we have seen in the history of our country in terms of the replacement of the entire Royal Canadian Navy defense platform. But I don't think you can do one without the other. I think surely we can emphasize the progress that we've been making, and we have made clearly, and we have highlighted that. But we have to be clear-eyed if we are going to come up with a new vision and bring about the necessary investment about what our shortcomings are. And look, in the age of information and open source intelligence, we don't need the satellites and the drones in the sky to tell us what's happening in Ukraine. We simply turn on CNN. And we can see, a large battalion of Russians moving in on the city of Kiev. So, the idea that we're talking down our country, I don't think that's the intent, and it's certainly not the theme that I thought was emerging from this discussion, other than to point out that there is so much more to do, and we seem, frankly, paralyzed to get on with some of these projects, and flowery language and reports and with great respect, having these discussions doesn't move the dial unless there is budgetary commitments. And that's not partisan. That's simply pointing out that we have not done enough.
And if I may respond as well, Whitney, I thank you for your question. And maybe this is an opportunity for me to say more positively that I think the creation of Nunavut and the settlement of the Inuit land claim by Canada has actually established a model for the world and dealing with the challenge of protecting protected areas and the environment and development by giving Inuit who are the majority in Nunavut, as you know, 85%, a really solid voice in a co-managed regulatory regime, and also giving the Inuit of Nunavut a guaranteed share of resource royalties and revenues. I think if this model were applied in the rest of Canada, where there is enormous conflict over developments with Indigenous peoples, and perhaps in the rest of the world, we'd have a model for moving forward in a balanced way that could work very well in resolving some of these conflicts. And yes, Canada has devolved authority to territorial governments and is almost on the verge of completing the devolution of management of land-based resources to the 3 territorial governments, with Nunavut being the last one. You know, this is progress. But I do believe that we can't talk about our interconnected issues. We need to address our shortcomings in order for people to thrive in the North. We're talking in this conference and in this panel about infrastructure, and there we are woefully lacking. We have a housing crisis that is causing extreme health and physical and mental health problems in Nunavut. We have grossly inadequate broadband infrastructure in a region that needs broadband more than any other part of the country. You know, we have no road connections in the north. So we're monitor what's going on in the Northwest Passage, and we don't have the ability to patrol the Northwest Passage, despite the slow progress with the Arctic offshore patrol vessels, which you know have very limited ice breaking capacity, as you know. So I don't mind talking about some of the progress that's been made. I'm very proud of the world-class land claims settlement in Nunavut, which is the envy of Indigenous peoples all over the world. But at the same time, it is indisputable that we are seriously lacking in vital infrastructure. And it's really shameful how issues like housing have been neglected to such a point that our social indicators and our suicide rates are you know, set world records. And I'm sorry, I can't ignore that. I don't think we can be disjointed in our visions and our frank assessment about realities on the ground and on the water. Thank you.
So I'm going to, with Jessica, start wrapping up what I think has been a really important and valuable sort of discussion. And I'd like to thank both of you for being candid and sharing not only your experience, but also your vision, and recognizing that we can't not afford to invest in our Arctic. We cannot, you know, afford not to strengthen our diplomatic, you know, ties with our Arctic neighbors, and that we need to see the development of a Canadian Arctic strategy that touches on many of the key areas of investment related to transportation, to energy, to telecommunications. It has tremendous value and necessity for those that live in the North, but also for our national security. And so we've seen countries like Germany, you know, in days change national policy. And we know that in the past, many politicians, many governments have said, you know, we need to be patient. It takes time, you know, and there's lots of sort of hurdles or barriers. And yet, now in the last 2 weeks, we have seen action that we've never seen to, you know, to this degree. And I do believe that we must act, and we must act quickly, but we must act smartly and strategically and together.
Great. And I just want to follow up on one piece. You know, I don't think this is supposed to be, and I don't see it as a session of just talking down or seeing deficiencies only in Canada. I think part of this whole conference is to understand and recognize how much opportunity we have in the North, from everything from growing populations to critical minerals to the potential to use our cold weather to actually create new innovations. And so I think it's kind of a moment to take stock of where we are, what this moment means and what it could mean, and how we can then move forward to actually reach so much of the potential and opportunity that there is in the North. And I think that most people sitting in this room, that's where the frustration is born from, is we could be doing so much, so how do we do it? Let's do it and let's get on with it. And are we at this moment of time, this moment of time where we can actually be forced to look at that in our face and say, okay, it's time to get on with it. So to say that to end. So
Thank you, Peter.
I want to thank you both.